It wasn't the scalpel, or the cold rush of the spinal block turning her legs to nothing. It wasn't even the moment the anesthesiologist told Shay Lamont, in a voice deliberately flat and steady, that her blood pressure had spiked to a level they couldn't wait on. The worst part, the part that would come back to her at 3 in the morning for months afterward, was looking at the ceiling of the operating theater, and realizing that Wade still hadn't picked up. Not once, not on the first call from the charge nurse, not on the second, not on the third. He wasn't stuck in traffic. She didn't know yet what he was. She was 34 weeks along and they were cutting her open, and somewhere outside that door, her husband of 9 years simply wasn't there. Shay had been on shift when it happened. She'd been a pediatric nurse for 11 years, long enough to recognize the signs before most people would have. The headache building behind her eyes since noon had felt different from a normal pregnancy headache, heavier, more insistent, with a kind of pressure that sat at the base of her skull and didn't move. Her hands had felt wrong when she'd charted her 2 o'clock notes. By the time her colleague Preet found her gripping the nursing station counter with both hands and quietly told her to sit down right now, Shay's vision had already started to blur at the edges. The blood pressure reading sent the room into motion. She remembered being wheeled down a hallway she'd walked 100 times, seeing it now from a completely different angle, thinking in strange clinical detachment, fetal distress secondary to severe preeclampsia, indicated delivery. She'd thought it in textbook language because it was easier than thinking it in human language, which would have been, the baby is coming 8 weeks early and I am completely alone. Her phone was in the pocket of her abandoned scrubs. Her husband did not pick up. They delivered Milo at 10:04 p.m. on a Wednesday in October. He weighed 4 pounds and 1 ounce, and they took him straight to the NIC before she was even closed up, but she heard him cry, a thin, fierce, furious sound, and she grabbed the anesthesiologist's forearm and held on until the shaking in her own hands stopped. By the time they moved her to recovery, her mother Ruth was already there. Ruth Lamont had driven from Canada the moment Preet called her, and she had the look of a woman who had been crying in the elevator and composed herself before coming through the door. Shay recognized it, because it was exactly what she would have done. The baby, Shay said immediately. Milo is in the NICU, he's breathing on his own. Ruth took her daughter's hand. He's small but he came out angry. That's your side of the family. Where's Wade? The pause lasted only a second. Ruth was not a woman who left silences if she could help it. He's on his way, she said. He arrived at 12:30 a.m. He stood in the doorway of the recovery room looking slightly underdressed for the October cold, jacket wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd grabbed it off the back of a chair somewhere, and he said, God, Shay, I'm so sorry, my phone was... Was what? She asked. He didn't finish the sentence. He stayed 40 minutes. He looked at Milo through the NICU glass for about 5 of them, stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, not reaching for Shay, not pressing his palm to the glass the way she'd seen other fathers do. Then he said he needed to go home and get a few hours of sleep and would be back in the morning. He did not come back in the morning. Shay's best friend Joy was there when the sun came up. Joy Adoma had driven from Gatineau at 1 in the morning after Shay managed to text her, just the word Nico, and she'd stayed through the night in the chair beside the bed, and she was still there with 2 cups of hospital coffee when Shay woke, and the first words out of her mouth were not about Wade but, "Can I see Milo?" They got her into a wheelchair and brought her down the hall. He was perfect in the way only NICU babies are perfect, impossibly small, more wires and tubes than seemed right. His chest rising and falling with the careful rhythm of a monitored system. His hands were barely larger than the pad of Shay's thumb. He had dark hair. She thought he had her nose, or maybe she needed something to recognize. She put her hand through the porthole of the isolette and touched his arm, and he stirred. Hi, she whispered. I'm your mom. She didn't cry. She wasn't done being angry enough to cry. Joy told her what she'd found out 2 days later, when Shay was stronger and the worst of the medical crisis had passed. Joy told it the way she told most difficult things, directly, without softening it beyond what was necessary, because she respected Shay too much to treat her as someone who couldn't handle the truth. You know, Preet was the one who called Wade the night it happened, Joy said, 3 times between 9:30 and 10. He didn't pick up. The call log is in your file. I know. What you don't know is where he was. Joy opened Instagram on her phone, a public account belonging to a woman named Chloe Pierce. A story posted at 9:51 p.m. on the night of Milo's birth, from a restaurant called 19 on Elgin Street. The kind of place with soft lighting and a tasting menu that cost more than Shay's weekly groceries. In the background of the story, Slightly out of focus but recognizable to anyone who'd spent 9 years studying that particular face was Wade. The caption read, "Can't believe this nation." Shay looked at the timestamp 9:51 p.m. Preet had called at 9:34, 9:41 and 9:58. The Nick had delivered Milo at 10:04. She posted that, Shay said slowly, while they were trying to reach him. Yes. While I was in surgery. Yes. The machines in the room beeped quietly. Down the hall Milo was working on breathing. Who is she? Shay asked. Junior associate at his firm 27. Joy paused. I screenshotted everything. Shay looked at the phone for another long moment, then she set it face down on the blanket. Good, she said, so did I. Wade came back on day 3. He stood in the NICU doorway with the particular expression of someone who expected to be welcomed and was surprised to find he wasn't. Shay was doing skin to skin, Milo's warm weight against her chest, the monitors tracking every breath, and she watched her husband look at his son, and she watched his face do the thing she had once loved. That moment of overwhelm he got when something hit him harder than he'd expected. She felt nothing about it, that surprised her. He looks good, Wade said. He's been off the ventilator since yesterday. His primary nurse is Deb. She knows his schedule. You should introduce yourself. Wade sat in the chair across from her. Shia. I know about Chloe. He went very still. I know where you were when Preet called 3 times. I know what she posted. I know the timestamps. It's not. Don't, she said quietly. Please don't tell me what it is or isn't. I am holding our son who came into the world 8 weeks early and I have nothing left for whatever you were going to say next. Wade looked at the floor then. I didn't know how serious it was. You didn't know because you didn't pick up. He left 20 minutes later. He said he needed time to think. The following morning, Ruth drove Shay to a meeting with Andrea Moss, a family lawyer in the Glebe whose card the hospital social worker had passed along. Andrea had short silver hair, and the kind of stillness that came from having sat across from a great many people in very bad situations and helped most of them through. Shay put Joy's screenshots on the table. She put the call log on the table. She put the admission record showing Wade's arrival time, 2.5 hours after Milo was delivered, on the table. Andrea looked at everything carefully and then looked at Shay. Is there more? I went through our shared cloud account. There are messages going back 8 months, restaurant reservations, a weekend he marked as a client retreat that was actually a hotel in Montreal. Copies. Everything. Andrea nodded once. Then let's talk about how you want to proceed. Wade's next move surprised even Andrea. 3 weeks after Milo came home, 3 weeks of Shay managing feeds every 2 hours, of tracking oxygen levels, of falling into bed at 2 a.m. and being up again at 4. All of it held together by Ruth sleeping on the pull-out couch and Joy arriving with groceries and the specific determination of someone who refuses to let the person she loves sink. Wade served her with papers. He was seeking shared custody. The document claimed Shay's medical crisis had left her with significant postpartum complications that made sole custody inadvisable. It mentioned her anxiety. It mentioned a single therapist's appointment from her second trimester that she'd attended exactly once. It described her as emotionally volatile following a traumatic birth experience. He had been building this case for 3 weeks, while she was keeping their son alive. Shay read the document once, set it on the counter, and called Andrea. He filed, she said. I know, I got the notification 20 minutes ago. Andrea's voice was level. He's not going to win, but it's going to get harder before it gets easier. How much harder? Everything goes on the record. The affair, the timeline, the Instagram post, his absence. All of it becomes part of the public filing. Do it, Shay said. You're certain? He called me emotionally volatile in a legal document while I was home alone with a premature infant at 2 in the morning. Yes, I'm certain. Andrea's response was thorough. It included the call logs, the Instagram archive with timestamps, a written statement from Preet, a statement from the charge nurse who had documented Wade's arrival time, the hotel receipts from Montreal, the text messages from the shared cloud account. And one more thing, a statement from a woman named Barb, who had worked at Wade's firm for 12 years and who told Andrea, quietly and with the contained fury of someone who had been wanting to say this for a while, that Chloe had known exactly what she was getting into, that Chloe had referred to Shay's pregnancy as his baggage in an office context, that on the morning after Milo's birth, Chloe had come in and shown the Instagram story to 2 colleagues and called it the most incredible night. She showed people at the office, Shay said when Andrea told her. While Milo was in the NICU, she showed people. Yes. Shay sat with that. The cruelty that was so comfortable in itself it brought receipts to work. Put it all in, she said. The Honorable Justice Theriot had been presiding over family matters for 19 years and she said, without raising her voice, that she found the respondent's claim regarding the applicant's emotional stability to be without foundation, given the documented circumstances of the child's birth, and the respondent's own failure to be present during same. She granted Shay primary custody. Wade received supervised access contingent on a completed parenting assessment. Outside the courthouse it was November, and the air smelled like wood smoke and the first hard edge of winter. Shay stood on the steps and breathed until the shaking in her chest settled. She had not cried through any of it. She had been saving it somewhere without meaning to. What do you want to do now? Joy asked. I want to go see Milo, Shay said, and then I want to figure out what comes next. What came next was slower and harder than the courtroom, because surviving the acute thing is only ever the beginning. Shay went back to work part-time when Milo was 4 months old. Her mother came 3 days a week. Joy filled in the rest. Shay had been a pediatric nurse for 11 years and she went back to it the way she went back to most hard things, methodically, not pretending it was easy and not waiting until it was. She started writing late at night, not with any particular plan. She started because she was awake and Milo was asleep, and she needed somewhere to put what it had felt like to lie on an operating table and reach for a hand that wasn't there. She started with that and followed it forward. The writing became a blog she called What We Carry Home, about the NICU, about single motherhood, about rebuilding a life that had come apart at exactly the moment it was supposed to begin. She didn't name Wade, she didn't name Chloe, she didn't need to. Women found it. That was the part that surprised her. She hadn't published it anywhere in particular. It lived on a free platform with a template she'd chosen because it loaded fast on mobile, and within 6 weeks she had several thousand readers and more messages than she could answer, all of them some version of the same thing. I thought I was completely alone in this. She wasn't. It turned out nobody was. Joy pointed out, after about 3 months, that staying up until 2 in the morning, providing free emotional support to strangers on the internet, was not a sustainable business model, and that Shay had built something real and should consider treating it that way. Shay found this framing more motivating than any encouragement had been. She built something sustainable. Wade, in the meantime, was building nothing at all. He missed his first supervised access appointment, then his second. His parenting assessment was delayed because he hadn't completed the required paperwork. His firm placed him on administrative leave in January, something related, Shay heard through Andrea, to a compliance review that had surfaced questions about how certain client files had been managed. By spring he was gone from the firm entirely. Chloe had left him in February. Shay didn't feel what she'd expected to feel when she heard that. She'd braced for something, satisfaction, or the specific cold relief of watching consequences arrive. What she felt instead was a kind of blankness, and then she realized the blankness was actually the good thing. It meant she'd gotten to the other side of it. Wade had become, without her quite noticing, irrelevant. He was paperwork. He was an amount on a monthly bank transfer. He was a name in Milo's file. He was no longer someone she spent her energy on. Milo took his first steps at 11 months, 8 days ahead of his adjusted age. He stood up from the coffee table, let go with both hands, looked startled at himself, and then walked directly into Shay's arms with the complete confidence of someone who had never genuinely doubted he would get where he was going. She held him and pressed her face into his hair and thought, "We made it, we actually made it." The blog post she wrote that night was the second one to go widely shared. She wrote it in 20 minutes, still in the same clothes, Milo asleep across her lap. She wrote about celebrating a milestone completely alone, not in the devastated sense but in the clear-eyed one, the kind of alone that knows exactly what it survived to get here. 300,000 people read it in a week. The blog became a column, the column became a book proposal. She signed a deal in the spring and spent Milo's nap times writing, pouring into the manuscript the affair, the operating theater, the empty doorway, the NICU, the custody fight, the long and unglamorous work of rebuilding a life from the components that remained when everything false had been stripped away. Her editor read the first draft and said, "Women are going to feel seen by this in a way that doesn't happen very often." That was what she'd wanted, not to perform strength, to make the actual experience of it visible, including the parts where strength looked like sitting on the bathroom floor at 11 p.m. and still getting up at midnight for the feed. She started being honest on the blog about the hard days too, after a therapist suggested it, The nights she cried after putting Milo down, the anxiety medication, the weeks where the only thing keeping her on schedule was the schedule itself. The response was larger than anything she'd posted before. Women thanked her for showing them that they didn't have to be perfect to be surviving. She met Reese at a family support group for NICU graduates that ran out of a community center in the Glebe on Tuesday evenings. She'd been invited to speak to newly discharged families. Someone had read the blog and asked, and she'd said yes. Reese Gallagher was there because his daughter Nell had come home from the NICU 16 months earlier, and he was, as he said when it was his turn to introduce himself, still working out how to stop checking her chest rise while she slept. "You never fully stop," the facilitator said. "That is terrifying," he said, and the room laughed, and something in Shay's chest did something she had not felt it do in a long time. She didn't let herself think about it right away. She was careful with herself about that. She'd spent 2 years learning to trust her own judgment again, and she knew that loneliness and readiness were two different things, and she was committed to knowing the difference. But she kept noticing him. The way he listened when other people spoke. The way he responded to something Shay said about the NICU monitors as if what she'd said had actually mattered to him, and he'd actually heard it rather than just waiting for his turn. The small fluency with which he handed Nell a cup of water without being asked. After the group ended, they walked half a block in the same direction, before either of them acknowledged it, and then they stood in the March cold, and talked for 40 minutes about their children, with the ease of two people who had both been to the bottom of something, and understood what coming back up had taken. "I should let you get home," he said eventually. "Yes," she agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. He said, "Can I give you my number?" Not in a complicated way. "In case Nell has a rough week and you don't mind questions from someone who is trying very hard to act like he has this sorted." "I'm a pediatric nurse," Shay said. "I don't mind." She texted him the next day with a resource on toddler sleep. He replied an hour later to say it had already worked and added, "Thank you, you may have saved my life." She laughed out loud. It caught her off guard. They were careful about it from the beginning. Not cautious in the way that's really fear, but careful in the way that's really respect. For themselves, for their children, for the process of two people building something, rather than one person trying to absorb the weight of another. He told her early, plainly, that his marriage had ended badly. Not betrayal, just a long unraveling. 2 years of trying to hold together something that had already gone, and that he wasn't interested in pretending any of that hadn't happened. She told him she appreciated that more than he probably knew. She told him her own story over coffee in May, with Milo at Ruth's for the afternoon. She told it the way she'd learned to, as something that happened to her, not something that defined her. When she finished, Reese was quiet for a moment. "That photograph she posted," he said, "at that restaurant, while you were in surgery." "Yes. I don't have words for that. It took me a while to find words for it either. I went through a stage where all I could feel about it was rage, then a stage where I felt nothing. Then I realized the nothing was actually the good sign. It meant I'd gotten to the other side of it. And now?" She considered. "Now it's evidence something that happened, was documented, was used in a court of law, and became irrelevant." She picked up her coffee. "The best thing that came from any of it is that I started writing, and the writing became something I never expected." She paused. "I wouldn't undo it. I know how that sounds, but I wouldn't." Rice looked at her with an expression she recognized because she'd worn something like it herself. The particular look of someone who has come through something hard, and met someone who has also come through something hard and felt, for the first time in a long time, that this specific kind of understanding is its own form of relief. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I mean it in the specific sense and also the larger one." "So am I," she said. Wade sent a message through his lawyer in November, asking if Shay would consider letting him attend Milo's second birthday party. He said he'd been doing the work. He said he was in a better place. He said several other things that Shay read once and then did not read again. She forwarded it to Andrea. She asked Andrea to respond that Milo's access arrangements were governed by the existing court order and any modifications would require the appropriate channels. Then she put down the phone and went to help her mother hang balloons. The party was small. Ruth, Joy, a few colleagues from the hospital, Reese with Nell, who was nearly 3 and had appointed herself Milo's supervisor in a way that he seemed to find entirely reasonable. The kitchen smelled like the cake Ruth had been making since 6 in the morning. The November light came through the back windows of Shay's house, her house, bought and moved into 8 months ago, with the yard she'd told herself they would gradually fill up, And it was the particular gold of late autumn, the light that makes everything look both temporary and exactly right. Milo stood in the middle of the living room with a balloon in each hand, delighted with himself. Shay stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and watched everyone she loved be in the same room at the same time, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized now. It had taken her a while to name it. It wasn't the absence of what she'd lost. It wasn't the shape of what had been taken from her and then recovered. It was something else entirely, the specific quiet satisfaction of a life that is genuinely actually hers. Joy appeared at her elbow. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The one you make when you're happy, and you're still a little surprised by it." Shay looked at her best friend. "Is that a real thing I do?" "You've done it approximately 400 times in the last year. I've been keeping track." Across the room Reese caught Shay's eye. He raised an eyebrow in the way that meant "you okay?" and she nodded in the way that meant "yes, actually yes." Outside the yard was empty and waiting for spring. There was still so much left to build. She wasn't afraid of any of it.